Approximately 90% of human beings, across every culture and every historical period that has ever been studied, preferentially use their right hand for tasks requiring fine motor precision. This number is strange in a way that becomes more apparent the longer you sit with it. It is not 50%, which is what you might expect from a trait with no particular biological pressure attached to it, a trait that should, in principle, split roughly evenly across a population if handedness were determined by nothing more than random developmental noise. It is also not 100%, which is what you might expect if right-hand dominance conferred some overwhelming and unambiguous survival advantage that would have driven left-handedness to complete extinction over the long course of human evolutionary history. It is a remarkably stable and remarkably specific 90%, a ratio that has held with only minor variation across every human population and every historical period researchers have been able to examine, stretching back into deep prehistory as far as the archaeological evidence allows us to look. No other species shows anything resembling this pattern. Many individual animals across many species show a personal handedness preference, a favored paw or limb that a given individual consistently uses over the other, but these individual preferences, when aggregated across an entire species, typically distribute close to 50-50, exactly what you would expect if handedness in those species reflected purely individual developmental variation with no population-level directional bias. Human beings are, as far as researchers have been able to determine, the only species on the planet that shows a strong, stable, and overwhelming population-level bias toward one side. And understanding why has become one of the more genuinely puzzling and multidisciplinary questions in the science of human evolution. Let's begin with what the archaeological and paleontological evidence reveals about how far back this specifically human 90% pattern extends. The archaeologist Natalie Uomini at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History has conducted extensive research using the specific wear patterns and fracture marks left on stone tools by early hominins, finding that the characteristic asymmetric wear patterns consistent with right-hand dominance are already clearly present in stone tools dating back at least 1.4 million years, associated with Homo habilis and early Homo erectus populations, well before the emergence of anatomically modern humans. Uomini's research, which has also examined dental wear patterns on hominin fossils, based on the observation that early hominins frequently held food or hides in their teeth while cutting with a handheld tool, producing characteristic scratch marks whose direction reveals which hand was doing the cutting, found consistent evidence of the same approximately 90% right-hand bias extending back through the hominin fossil record for well over 1 million years, indicating that this specific and unusual population-level handedness bias is not a recent cultural development, but an extremely ancient feature of the hominin lineage, likely predating the emergence of our own species by a considerable margin. This deep antiquity is theoretically significant because it suggests that whatever produced the 90% bias must be connected to something fundamental about hominin brain organization that emerged very early in our evolutionary lineage, rather than being a more recent cultural or technological development specific to modern humans. This connects directly to the most influential and most extensively researched theoretical account of why human handedness developed its specific asymmetric pattern: the relationship between handedness and the lateralization of language function in the brain. The neuroscientist Michael Corballis at the University of Auckland, whose extensive research on brain lateralization and the evolution of language has been foundational to this field, has documented that the left hemisphere of the brain, which controls the right side of the body, is also the hemisphere responsible for language production and processing in approximately 95 to 96% of right-handed individuals, and in a majority, though a somewhat less overwhelming majority, of left-handed individuals as well. Corballis's research proposes that this striking correspondence between the population percentage showing right-hand dominance and the population percentage showing left hemisphere language dominance is not coincidental, but reflects a shared underlying developmental and evolutionary process, in which the same evolutionary pressures that drove the lateralization of language function to one hemisphere of the brain also produced, as a connected consequence, the lateralization of fine motor control to the same hemisphere. Corballis's specific theoretical proposal, which he calls the gestural origins hypothesis of language evolution, argues that human language may have evolved initially from a system of manual gesture rather than vocalization alone, a theoretical account that would provide a direct and parsimonious explanation for why hand dominance and language dominance became so tightly linked to the same cerebral hemisphere, If early hominin communication depended substantially on manual gesture, then the same hemisphere responsible for controlling the fine, sequential, and precisely timed hand movements that gestural communication requires would be under direct evolutionary pressure to also become the hemisphere responsible for the increasingly sophisticated sequential processing that vocal language eventually came to require as well, producing a single, unified lateralized system responsible for both functions rather than two independently evolved and separately lateralized systems that happened, purely by coincidence, to end up on the same side. This account has been extended and refined by the neuroscientist Onur Güntürkün at Ruhr University Bochum, whose comparative research across multiple animal species has documented that behavioral and neural lateralization, functional specialization of the left and right sides of the brain for different cognitive tasks, is actually a much more widespread phenomenon across the animal kingdom than researchers had previously assumed, found in species ranging from fish to birds to numerous other vertebrates, but that the specific combination of population-level directional bias, meaning a bias that points the same direction across the overwhelming majority of individuals in the population, rather than being randomly distributed between left and right at the individual level, appears to be considerably rarer and to require a specific set of evolutionary conditions that Güntürkün's research has attempted to characterize. Güntürkün's research proposes that population-level directional lateralization, as opposed to the more common pattern of individual-level lateralization without population-level bias, tends to emerge specifically in species that rely heavily on social coordination and cooperative behavior, requiring individuals to correctly predict and coordinate with the lateralized behavior of other members of their group. This social coordination hypothesis proposes that if lateralization exists only at the individual level, with no consistent population-level directional bias, then each individual's specific pattern of lateralization provides no useful predictive information to other members of the group about how that individual is likely to behave in a coordination-relevant context. But if lateralization shows a strong population-level directional bias, then other group members can reliably predict and coordinate around the majority pattern, creating a specific social and coordination-related evolutionary advantage for directional population-level bias that would not exist for lateralization that remained randomly distributed at the individual level. This social coordination account connects in an interesting and complementary way to research conducted by the psychologist Chris McManus at University College London, whose extensive work on the genetics and evolutionary history of human handedness has documented that handedness shows a specific and somewhat unusual pattern of genetic inheritance, one that does not follow simple Mendelian dominant recessive patterns, but instead appears to reflect what geneticists call a balanced polymorphism, a genetic situation in which multiple different genetic variants are maintained simultaneously within a population because each variant confers some advantage under specific circumstances, preventing any single variant from driving the others to extinction through simple directional selection. McManus's research proposes a specific genetic model in which handedness is influenced by variation at a gene he designates the D and C alleles, where the D allele strongly biases development toward right-handedness and left-hemisphere language dominance, while the C allele, rather than biasing development toward left-handedness specifically, instead leaves handedness to be determined essentially by chance, meaning that individuals carrying two copies of the C allele would be expected to show handedness distributed randomly, close to 50-50, while individuals carrying at least one copy of the D allele would show the strong right-hand bias characteristic of the majority population pattern. McManus's model, when tested against actual population data on handedness inheritance patterns across families, has produced predictions that align closely with the observed data, including the specific 90% population-level ratio and the specific patterns of handedness inheritance observed between parents and children. McManus's genetic model connects to an evolutionary puzzle that has attracted considerable research attention in its own right: why the C allele, which produces the minority pattern of left-handedness or randomly determined handedness, would be maintained within the population at all, rather than being eliminated by natural selection if right-hand dominance and the associated left-hemisphere language lateralization it typically accompanies confer a genuine and consistent survival or reproductive advantage. The evolutionary biologists Charlotte Faurie and Michel Raymond at the University of Montpellier have proposed what has become known as the fighting hypothesis to address this specific puzzle, documenting through cross-cultural and historical research that left-handedness appears to be maintained at systematically higher frequencies in societies and historical periods characterized by higher rates of interpersonal physical violence, including data drawn from traditional societies with documented histories of frequent intergroup conflict, and from historical records of violent crime and combat sports. Faurie and Raymond's research proposes that left-handedness confers a specific tactical advantage in direct physical confrontation, precisely because the overwhelming majority of the population, and therefore the overwhelming majority of an individual's potential opponents, are right-handed and have developed their combat instincts and pattern recognition based on the much more common experience of facing right-handed opponents, creating a specific element of unpredictability and tactical surprise that benefits a left-handed individual in direct physical confrontation, an advantage that would be expected to diminish as left-handedness becomes more common within a population, since the tactical surprise depends specifically on left-handedness remaining a numerical minority. This creates exactly the kind of frequency-dependent selection pressure that population genetics predicts would maintain a stable minority frequency of left-handedness within a population indefinitely, rather than either eliminating it entirely or allowing it to increase to parity with right-handedness, providing a compelling explanation for why the specific and stable 90-10 ratio has persisted across such an extended span of human evolutionary history, rather than drifting toward either extreme. There is a further dimension of this research that deserves careful attention, because it addresses a specific question the genetic and evolutionary accounts alone do not fully resolve: what the actual developmental process looks like inside the womb, and how early in individual human development the eventual handedness bias can first be detected. The developmental psychologist Peter Hepper at Queen's University Belfast has conducted extensive research using ultrasound imaging to document fetal hand movement and thumb-sucking behavior during pregnancy, finding that a clear and consistent preference for one hand over the other, overwhelmingly favoring the right hand in the large majority of fetuses studied, can be reliably detected as early as 10 weeks of gestation, and that this early fetal hand preference predicts the child's eventual postnatal handedness with remarkably high accuracy, in some of Hepper's longitudinal studies exceeding 90% concordance between the hand preference observed in the womb and the hand preference the same individual showed as a child years later. Hepper's research is significant because it establishes that human handedness is substantially determined by processes occurring very early in prenatal neural development, well before birth and well before any possible influence from postnatal social learning, parental modeling, or cultural pressure toward right-hand use, all of which have historically been proposed as at least partial explanations for the population-level right-hand bias. This finding does not rule out the possibility that postnatal social and cultural factors influence handedness at the margins, particularly in historical periods and cultural contexts where left-handedness was actively discouraged or suppressed through direct social pressure, but it does establish that the fundamental population-level bias itself has clear biological roots that are already substantially in place before any such postnatal influence could plausibly operate. The specific prenatal mechanism producing this early lateralization has been investigated by the neuroscientist Judith Rappaport and subsequent researchers examining the developing fetal nervous system, whose research has documented that asymmetries in gene expression relevant to later handedness can be detected in the spinal cord of the developing fetus even before the brain itself has developed sufficient complexity to be the primary driver of the asymmetry, a finding that has led some researchers, including the developmental biologist Sebastian Ocklenburg at Ruhr University Bochum, to propose that the ultimate origin of human-handedness may lie not in the brain directly, but in asymmetric gene expression occurring earlier in spinal cord development, with the brain's own subsequent lateralization for both motor control and language, potentially representing a downstream consequence of this earlier spinal asymmetry rather than its ultimate cause. Ocklenburg's research using post-mortem fetal tissue has documented measurable left-right asymmetries in the expression of specific genes within the spinal cord as early as 8 weeks of gestation, predating the developmental stage at which the cerebral cortex has developed sufficiently to plausibly serve as the primary source of the asymmetric signal, a finding that has meaningfully complicated the previously dominant assumption that handedness originates as a straightforwardly top-down consequence of brain lateralization. There is one further dimension of this research worth examining, because it addresses a specific and practically significant question that has attracted considerable attention outside the immediate research community: whether left-handedness is genuinely associated with any measurable cognitive or health differences relative to right-handedness, a question complicated by a long history of popular claims that have not always held up well under rigorous scientific scrutiny. The psychologist Marian Annett at the University of Leicester, whose extensive research on handedness helped establish the foundational right-shift theory that influenced much of the subsequent genetic modeling in this field, including the framework that Chris McManus later refined, documented that the relationship between handedness and cognitive ability is considerably more modest and more nuanced than popular accounts have often suggested. Annett's research found that individuals with a completely consistent and strong hand preference in either direction, whether strongly right-handed or strongly left-handed, tend to show slightly different average cognitive profiles compared to individuals with weaker or more mixed hand preference, but that these differences are generally small in magnitude and do not support the popular narrative in which left-handedness is straightforwardly associated with either enhanced creativity or, in less flattering accounts from earlier in the 20th century, cognitive or developmental deficits. The epidemiologist Marcel Kinsborn, whose broader research on brain lateralization has been influential in the clinical literature specifically, has documented that certain neurodevelopmental conditions, including some forms of dyslexia and other specific learning differences, show a statistically elevated but still modest association with atypical patterns of hemispheric lateralization, of which unusual or mixed-handedness patterns can be one behavioral marker, though Kinsborn's research has been careful to emphasize that this association is a statistical tendency observed at the population level rather than a reliable individual predictor, and that the substantial majority of left-handed individuals show no elevated likelihood of any such condition whatsoever. This research area has historically been complicated by a specific methodological difficulty. Earlier 20th century research on handedness and cognitive outcomes was frequently conducted in a cultural context where left-handed children were actively and sometimes forcibly retrained to use their right hand, a practice that itself appears to have been associated with genuine negative psychological and educational outcomes, creating a confound in older research literature between the effects of naturally occurring left-handedness itself and the effects of the often quite stressful process of enforced right-hand retraining that many left-handed individuals in earlier generations were subjected to, a confound that more recent research conducted in cultural contexts without this retraining pressure has worked to disentangle. What emerges from this substantial and genuinely multidisciplinary body of research is a picture of human-handedness not as a trivial or arbitrary developmental quirk, but as a deeply rooted evolutionary feature, connected directly to the lateralization of language in the brain, extending back well over 1 million years into the hominin fossil record, maintained through a specific genetic mechanism involving a balanced polymorphism, and stabilized at its particular 90-10 ratio through a frequency-dependent selection pressure connected to the tactical advantages of numerical rarity in physical confrontation. The hand you reach for first, the one that holds the pen, that throws the ball, that performs the thousands of small acts of fine motor precision that fill an ordinary human life without your ever consciously choosing which hand should do the work, is not simply a matter of individual preference or developmental accident. It is a visible marker of one of the deepest and most ancient asymmetries in the human brain, a population-level pattern stretching back over 1 million years, connected to the same neural lateralization that made human language possible in the first place, and maintained at its particular and remarkably stable ratio by evolutionary forces that reach all the way from the deep structure of the developing brain to the tactical calculus of a physical confrontation between two early humans who never knew, in any conscious sense, that the hand each of them instinctively reached for first was itself the product of 1 million years of evolutionary history. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.